I'm incredibly excited for tonight's event. We're joined by three insightful and dedicated movement strategists from various corners of our wide-ranging left movements to make an assessment of a period in time like no other. Unfortunately, Vanessa Moses wasn't able to join us today. She's a little under the weather, so we're going to miss her keen insights, but we hope she can join us again sometime soon. As all of us well know, the COVID pandemic has wrought and continues to bring unimaginable suffering, death, and trauma to millions. Essential workers have been forced to risk their lives and safety to keep other people alive and a collapsing economy afloat. Human beings have been left in cages to suffer as infections spread uncontrollably in closed confines. A pivotal election saw major clashes among various political forces, including a resilient left and a resurgent right. Rent strikes and labor strikes became crucial flashpoints of resistance amidst the backdrop of raging wildfires and more climate chaos. And Black organizers led the largest sustained uprisings in US history to proclaim that Black lives matter and must be held sacred. So how did this past year and our ongoing period of overlapping crises reshape our political terrain? What are the conditions of our new normal? And what lessons should we draw upon from a year of organizing through catastrophe? And how do we on the left coalesce as a united political force to navigate what's ahead? To help us answer these questions, we're joined by Cindy Wiesner, Amna Akbar, and Isaac Ontiveros. First, Cindy. Cindy is a 30-year veteran of US and international movements and the executive director of Grassroots Global Justice, an alliance of over 60 US-based grassroots organizing groups comprised of working and poor people and communities of color. She was trained as a union organizer with Here in Oakland and went on to build worker centers in the Bay Area and Miami. She helped co-found the Climate Justice Alliance and was a leader in the People's Climate Movement. She's been active in many movement building initiatives and currently works with It Takes Roots, the Rising Majority, the Green New Deal Network, and the People's Bailout. Cindy is a lesbian of Salvadoran and Colombian and German descent, and a grassroots feminist, internationalist, and a movement strategist in Durham, North Carolina. Welcome, Cindy. Next, we're joined by Amna. Amna Akbar is a movement attorney and an associate professor of law at Ohio State University. Her research focuses on social movements, critical theory, and police, race, and inequality. Her scholarship explores the intersections of national security and criminal law and the potential for social movements to transform our thinking about law, law enforcement, and law reform. In her teaching and lawyering work, she's deeply committed and deeply engaged with law and organizing in Ohio and around the country. Welcome, Amna. And finally, Isaac. Isaac Ontiveros is an educator at National Nurses United, the largest union and professional association of registered nurses in the United States, with more than 170,000 members nationwide. He's worked in social, economic, and racial justice movements for over 15 years, including anti-prison industrial complex work, movement building, and labor organizations. Isaac is also a special part of our CPE family, having served as co-director of CPE with Rachel Herzing and currently serving on our board of advisors. That is an impressive set of credentials among all of you, to say the least. So I just want to again welcome Cindy, Amna, and Isaac. Cindy, I want to start our conversation with you, as your work is oriented both nationally and internationally. How have the overlapping crises of the past year normalized a new set of conditions, political conditions for the left, both nationally and internationally?
All right. Hey, everybody. Really happy to be here with you all this evening. I'm in Durham and we're on the East Coast with Amna. And so for you all, it's still afternoon. So first of all, I want to just say saludos a todos, todex, todas. I'm really grateful for you all and the Center for Political Education. I have a lot of great memories of 522 Valencia. And I got trained on like Marxism there by Eric Quesada. There was a bunch of parties I went to, fundraisers, like badass, like Palestinian liberation events and preparatory meetings for the Venceremos Brigade. And so I just really want to say a shout out to how important you all were for this institution and the legacy to my own political development, but also for so many of us in generations of folks and some folks I see in the chat. So, and I just want to thank you all for this invitation and my fellow panelists. And I'm really sad to be missing Vanessa Moses, the executive director of Causa Justa, who is just a phenomenal leader in the Bay Area, and just sending my love to her. And so, you know, I've been thinking, you know, so much about this concept of challenging, you know, the new normal. And, you know, I'm thinking about like what a moment we're in, right? We're almost a month and some days out of, you know, a white supremacist, misogynist, xenophobe, out of the White House, and through a victory that really was delivered by a multiracial Black and Brown-led front, united front. And so in a lot of ways, there's a lot to celebrate, right? And it's no small feat that we were able to do that. And, you know, Biden and Harris weren't our second, third, fourth, fifth choice, but I think it's really important for us to know that we were part of this broader anti-Trump front that came together to defeat neo-fascism squarely, but not only for us, but I think globally, right? And because we are in a fight, we're in a global fight against authoritarianism, right? And so as our Filipino comrades say, one down, right? And how that actually is really, really important for people in Brazil that are fighting to impeach Bolsonaro, in the fight in India, like the farm workers, massive millions of people in India fighting against austerity and against Modi. And then that we also hold a lot of grief, you know, and a lot of sadness. This week marks over 500,000 people here in, you know, on Turtle Island in the United States, unnecessarily, prematurely dying because of the lies, the inept of the Trump administration, right? In a lot of ways, genocide, right? Because of how the pandemic was not taken seriously from the very, very beginning. And in the next couple of weeks, we begin to approach the 1-year anniversary of the shutdowns in the United States, when everything began to change for all of us, right? And so I've been thinking about this title and the session about the word normal, right? And what's the hope of going back? And I think a lot about our compañera Berta Casarez. For many of you who may or may not know her, she was a feminist, social movement leader, internationalist, land defender. She was from the Lenca people in Honduras. And she, speaking of remembrance, is next week is her 5-year anniversary of her murder, and on March 2nd. And as her family and the movement talk about is of her siembra, right, which means seeding, of her planting, right. And I always think of, in the Trump years, I always think about like, well, what would Berta do? Or what would Berta say, right? And I go back to this quote that she said, and she said, "Let us wake up, humankind. We are out of time. We must shake our conscience free from the rapacious capitalism, racism, and patriarchy that will only assure our own self-destruction." So when I think about these words, right, Berta's words, it's more about like, how are we then understanding the moment that we're in? How are we making assessments of time, place, condition? How are we thinking about what's the, you know, the main task around building coherence and alignment around diverse sectors of society? And also understanding that like millions of people have gotten radicalized, not only through the pandemic, but through the uprisings last summer of led by Movement for Black Lives and Defense of Black Lives, but also in the most, what I would say, important election in our own lifetime, right? But we have to be clear that what was considered normal is what we all fought against, right? There's like decades of neoliberal austerity from both Republicans and Democrats, exploitation of workers, the steady and sometimes blunt cutting back of the social safety net, the right wing's attempt to dismantle the state, you know, xenophobic Christian white supremacists, like basically running the US based on fear, isolation, enclosure, wanting to take us back to 1776, right? The free market being touted as the solutions to our economic woes, the bailing out of corporations to try to solve the magnitude of this problem, to climate deniers, pandemic deniers, to heteronormativity. Like all of that, we say hell no to all of that. That's not the normal that we want to be going back to, right? But at the same time, we understand the multiple colliding crises, right? And we're at these crossroads that we either need to continue thinking about the trend towards global, you know, authoritarianism, or what we're beginning to live now, like the diversity of a sort of soft neoliberalism, neoliberalism light, as some of our friends would say, or something completely new. Is something completely new being birthed, right, at this moment? And what I would say is that I believe now is the time, and many of us for decades have been working on really imagining a just transition to that new society, a just transition to a very dramatically different way of not living under capitalism, patriarchy, white supremacy, homophobia, transphobia, all of those things, right? Zionism, all of those pieces, right? And I think that part of what I believe is that this is an opportunity for us to think about not only the reorganization of the whole society, but define, like fight for the definition of what we mean good government for the people and the planet means. What social relationships, how social relationships have to be redefined in this moment. You know, because what seemed impossible a year ago, right? Completely like pie in the sky ideas. So it's like defunding the police, y'all are crazy, right? Like, you know, taking people, moratoriums on rent, you know, it's like you're like unrealistic, right? You're utopian. But I think what we've been able to see is moratoriums on rent and mortgages, cancellation of student debt, freeing people out of cages, detention centers, workers being visibilized, you know, being able to have hazard pay, masses of people demanding a people's bailout and not a corporate bailout, and not corporate bailout. Things like the Breathe Act beginning to come into being, like in Chicago, y'all, like just, I mean, not Chicago, Illinois, right? Being able to see the first steps of the Breathe Act are one of the visionary demands of the movement for Black lives starting to become policy. The Green New Deal, not the Green New Deal of like greenwashing or false solutions, but the real like regenerative, you know, renewable, visionary Green New Deal beginning to be a reality on some local and statewide levels, and hopefully paving the way to the national level, right? But I think that one of the things is that we've adapted, and in the pandemic, and we've still been able to make monumental change. And I think that we can't take that for granted, right? But this year, everyone, I think, got an X-ray vision. Everyone, you know, that's the thing that they say, what's your superpower? I think we all had X-ray vision, because what has been traditionally invisible, undervalued, underpaid, from domestic work, child rearing, food production, from growing it to making it to selling it to healthcare to teachers. All of this is what we would call reproductive labor, right? So I'm outing myself as a socialist feminist here, right? Reproductive labor. And now it's like completely visible, right? It's completely visible. No one can deny that this has kept us alive, right? No one can deny that essential workers and all this reproductive labor has kept us alive. But also no one can deny that all of us majority of us being at home has also become a site of struggle, right? And some of the domestic fear with the dynamics of increased violence, increased abuse, increased sort of the perpetuation of gender division of labor, right? We see the numbers, like, you know, the unemployment numbers of how many women in December were laid off and filing for unemployment, record numbers, majority of those being brown and Black women, right? We see the levels of violence, domestic violence, sexual assault skyrocketing. We see, and so part of this moment, right, is also how do we think about shifting patriarchal and colonial frameworks and policies and practices and replacing those with policies of ethics of care and collectivism, and really putting life at the center of the economy and not capital. And I think that to me is the fundamental sort of task for the left and for the movement, is like, how do we, you know, some of the main dangers that we see are around individualism and nationalism, right? Around going back to normal. But we know what that means is that certain people are disposable, right? And that we have to be able to make demands and create policies that like there's a drive to sort of say, let's do this incrementally, right? And that let's actually like create demands and policies that reinforce the system. And I actually think that's one of the main dangers, right? And so part of what we've been saying as like 3 paths forward is really that solidarity is our solution, right? And that's what we've seen from the mutual aid, from what people are doing in Texas and throughout the South and the Midwest in terms of being there for each other and being in community, providing care for our elders, for our most vulnerable in these moments, but really being able to also talk about what does that mean in the global context, right? As solidarity being our solution, that we must not let anyone be sacrificed and no one thrown under the bus, and that this is a moment of transformative demands and vision and really implementing our system alternatives perspective that ensures the dismantling of white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism. Okay, so I'm just gonna say with that, we at Grassroots Global Justice Alliance and our sister alliances and many of the movements that we're a part of, not only here in the US on Turtle Island, but around the world, really have this, you know, have been having this deep critique of the current economic system, right? That's based on investment, capital, productivity, and time invested. And we believe that this is a moment to retake the economy and really thinking about it as like caretakers of a house. If you think about economy and the root word being management of home, right? It's like we need to be the caretakers of the house, right? And that political proposals around systemic alternatives are so necessary right now. We have campesino farm workers talking about food sovereignty and agroecology. We have feminists and us talking about like, we need an anti-racist regenerative feminist economy. You have folks fighting for the commons. We have folks that are talking, indigenous folks talking about buen vivir and a sort of a completely different cosmovision. And I think that these are the kind of things that we need to be engaging in this moment, is really how are we thinking about the components of a new society and a new reorganization of our social relations. And I think that that's what's exciting about this moment, but also what I think is our main task. And so I'll leave it at that. And sorry to the interpreters, I know I was talking fast. So
thank you, Cindy. There's just so much to mine from even just your initial comments. I think I'm really appreciative of all of your insights. I really like what you said about our X-ray vision around reproductive labor, and I think it's a good segue to talking, Isaac, about one set of workers, essential workers, that were very much a focal point. Healthcare workers were a focal point for the pandemic, and thinking about working conditions and thinking about pre-existing conditions in the largest sense possible. Nurses in particular were asked to care for the sick and the dying while struggling to manage, excessive patient loads and extended shifts and inadequate personal protective equipment. I'm wondering, Isaac, if you can share a little bit with us from the lessons we can get from the lessons that nurses learned organizing together under a year of healthcare catastrophe.
Sure. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Amna. And then sending strength and wellness to our comrade, Vanessa. Thank you to CPE. Thank you for everybody that's here. And thank you for thank you to our interpreters. So yeah, thank you for the question. I'm gonna look at some notes, if that's okay to say, disciplined and on time. So from a perspective shaped by unionized nurses, there are kind of 4 areas of thinking that I thought might be useful to bring to the table this evening as we work together to draw lessons from our conditions and our recent struggles. Just a spoiler alert, this ain't gonna be rocket science, okay? So apologies about that, but maybe restating the obvious, maybe there's something to that as we think about normal, new normal, and so on, right? So kind of 4 things. So 1, thinking about the intersecting political, social, and economic forces and crises that make up this catastrophe. That is good work to do. So nurses and other frontline health workers saw how the pandemic exacerbated pre-existing conditions, right? This is a term that nurses use to describe health. I'm gonna think about them in political and social terms. So what were some of those pre-existing conditions? Nurses confronted and health workers and frontline workers in general, the brutality of neoliberal politics and capitalist exploitation, the legacy of racism and white supremacy in the US, and the deprivations of right-wing politics as it relates to attacks on the working class communities, particularly working class communities of color. So when we think of normal, maybe we're thinking of new normals. We're also thinking of old normals at the same time, right? Nurses and other health workers confront a profit over people healthcare system, which inhibits the ability of nurses to provide care and for patients to receive care. So, while more than 500,000 people have died from the virus, and while nurses have had to fight tooth and nail for basic protections, we've seen healthcare corporations make billions of dollars in profits. We've seen them close hospitals. We've seen them cut jobs, roll back safety standards, and advance long-term anti-worker strategies. Nurses are caring for patients who are having trouble accessing basic care and struggling to put food on the table. In the course of the pandemic, tens of millions of people lost their jobs and their healthcare. 1 in 4 Black, Brown, and Asian people are out of work. Almost 1 in 3 Latinx women are unemployed related to the pandemic. More than 50% of transgender people have had their work hours reduced, and around 20% have become unemployed. And right now, there's around 100 million people in this country who have little to no healthcare. This is in this devastating public health crisis. So federal aid and stimulus that we've heard and talked and experienced has left too many workers with a nightmarish choice of its inadequacies have left too many workers with the nightmarish choice of, go to work and maybe get the virus, or don't go to work and don't eat. So of course, then nurses also confront the racialized and gendered nature of this catastrophe, as Cindy was speaking about. Working class, trans people, and poor people of color have been put at greater risk of exposure to sickness and death. These are pre-existing issues. People of color make up a majority of essential workers in key areas, as well as those who are undocumented, homeless, and in prison. Black, Brown, and Indigenous people, as we know, are 3 to 5 times more likely to contract the virus and at least twice as likely to die on average as white people. As conditions are compounded for immigrant and refugee people, people in migrant detention, or conditions are compounded for immigrant, refugee people, people in migrant detention, and for imprisoned people. On federal, state, and local levels, we've confronted a brutalist right-wing program, which demobilized most all state capacity that could have tackled the pandemic. It doubled down with denialism and racism. It pulled out of the World Health Organization and deployed belligerent foreign policy agendas. Now, there has been some shifts, but there is plenty work to do. I think that's a key lesson. Okay, kind of second area. The front lines are animated by intense class conflict in the workplace. So the healthcare catastrophe has hit nurses and health workers hard, right? over 3,000 healthcare workers have died of COVID-19, including over 300 nurses. We have rage around that, and we also send strength and love and condolences to their families and friends and coworkers all day, every day. So the failure of employers and our government to provide proper protections has endangered all nurses and many, if not all workers. But we know certain groups of nurses have been harmed disproportionately. So 60% of nurses who died of COVID-19 have been nurses of color. 32% have been Filipino nurses, even though Filipino nurses make up only 4% of registered nurses in the United States. This racialized and gendered devastation has given force to, has animated the tooth and nail fight for protective equipment, for safety regulations, for patient to staff ratios, and for union protections. Through creative action that sought to, push to advance, but also to defend the safety of all workers, nurses have joined others in mobilizing, making gains, and winning victories. I think thinking about victories is where we can draw some of our most important lessons. National Nurses United nurses have held over 1,500 actions to overcome capital-driven safety waivers, right? They've forced employers to provide personal protective equipment, and they've gotten in like places like California have worked to get laws passed where hospitals are required to stockpile 3 months of protective equipment. This may sound technical, but I think, and as we think in other parts of this time together, this win to have stockpiles of equipment has significant ramifications for struggles around supply chain and just-in-time modes of production, as we've seen our fellow workers in Amazon, for example, what they're struggling around. During the height of this pandemic, 1,800 nurses at Mission Health Hospital in Asheville, North Carolina, overcame an aggressive union busting campaign by one of the largest hospital corporations, and they joined our union during the pandemic. This was the biggest win for healthcare workers in the South since the 70s. Third kind of thing, and I'm looking at time here, so sorry to talk fast here. So the third thing, kind of lesson area. Workplace struggles are shaping and are being shaped by wider struggles, right? Locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally. Again, this ain't rocket science, right? So from the perspective of the nurses that I work with, through the Global Nurses United Network, which is a network comprised of healthcare workers, unions in around 30 countries globally, both of the global South and the global North. Nurses have worked to forge international solidarity with other workers around the pandemic. This has included like defending workers who are up against authoritarian or depraved political regimes, and also by pushing the World Health Organization to advance better global standards for health workers and workers in general. Nurses have also acted in solidarity with teachers, longshoremen, the Amazon workers who are in the thick of the struggle right now, and other workers in motion. Our many workplace actions have joined. There's been something like, I think this is a low ball number, but there's been something around 1,000 strikes and countless other workplace actions across a variety of sectors led by working people. Nurses have kept up momentum toward winning Medicare for all, right? That's a long, protracted struggle, but that struggle has actually grown in this past year. And included with that is the ability of frontline workers to rally their communities to defend the gains of workers and to include the energies of their fellow workers. The social and political or the social and public health crisis of racism, there's a, we heard about this already, but the social and public health crisis of racism in the United States obviously came to a roaring head during the 2020 uprisings against police and police violence and other structural violence. And so we've seen hard and inspiring work from nurses and other frontline workers to fuse their demands for workplace safety and pandemic relief with the fight to confront long legacies of racism in their workplaces and in their communities. This energy was also poured into the effort to win the electoral defeat of the Trump regime. As Cindy noted, that is also a protracted struggle, right? Finally, and I'm noticing the clock, I'll be brief here. Finally, I think it's critical, and this is maybe re-saying what Cindy already said. I apologize, I don't mean to be redundant here, but I think it's critical to think about the intersections of anti-racism, gender liberation, and the agencies of workers, both thinking over this past year and thinking toward the future, right? So healthcare workers make up the largest labor section, or the largest labor sector in the United States. And women make up the largest part of that workforce, with women of color making up a very substantial part of it. So through a kind of good lefty race, class, gender lens, there's, I think, rich thinking to do about who makes up the working class, right? Who could and should be in the lead, and what sort of transformative potential comes from building and pushing forward workers' power. In a world that is still very much threatened by right-wing authoritarianism, by vicious neoliberalism, I think the positionality of frontline workers, the fight for power in the workplace, this has potentially profound implications for how we shape and reshape our understandings of the distribution of wider political and economic power, and also of self-determination, democracy, solidarity, and care. I think I'll leave it there, and I'm looking forward to thinking more through this stuff with you all. Thank you.
Thanks, Isaac. So much to glean from your comments, and I think that the one recurring theme we're seeing here is what Cindy mentioned about a feminist regenerative economy, and I'm seeing some even comments in the chat, so we're going to have to dive into a little bit of that moving forward. Amna, there's few pre-existing conditions that mark the United States history than the violent repression of Black lives and Black people. And what we saw last year during the Floyd uprisings, and that you wrote in a widely circulated New York Times piece about, was that organizers, as you said, were creating new grounds for multiracial mass movements with their capacious demands. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how the uprisings and the long-term organizing that actually undergirded that opened those new opportunities for the left, not only in challenging police violence, but also across sectors of the movement.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. Hi, everyone. It's so nice to be here. I'm really grateful to Hasmin, Thomas, Isaac, Cindy, Alexia, and Leah for being in this space together. So it's funny, all of the questions you put to us were different, and I feel like we're all kind of like riffing on the same themes, which I think is a good sign that we all know what the work is ahead. Okay, so the uprisings this past summer in direct response to Derek Chauvin's killing of George Floyd were really something to behold and participate in. For so many, it confirmed that we're living within a global historical crisis unlike anything we have seen. The scale of the uprisings, which were oft commented on as unprecedented in scale, and their multiracial composition suggested too that it wasn't just the organized left that understood this. Large segments of the population understand, in the way that Cindy and Isaac also explained, that police violence against Black people is a routine phenomenon that has no defense, and that policing is violence. And that central to the problem is that the neoliberal state form that focuses on violence in service of profit and land accumulation and dispossession, rather than meeting the needs of people. Police and military mobilized swiftly to end the protest in solidarity with Black people and against policing itself. At the same time, elected officials disavowed the capacity of the state to meet the needs of people under this pandemic, no personal protective equipment, no health care for all, no substantial rent relief, 2 tiny relief checks. There was a lot of important political theater within the rebellions, but one of its most important sequences was illustrating this contrast for all to see between a state that can mobilize millions of dollars and countless police and military wearing badges from the very many overlapping modes of policing and military under which we live, and the state that can't provide masks or guarantee income to abate the spread of a deadly disease that has intensified the violence of capitalism. The connections between what are often viewed as disparate struggles became more clear for us all, and they emerged on top of decades of organizing that makes the left stronger than it has been in my lifetime, even if we can also see that we have a long way to go. So I want to name a number of examples of where we can kind of see the interconnected modes of work. So Sunrise Movement, Critical Resistance, the Afro-Socialist Caucus of the Democratic Socialists of America, Southerners on New Ground, and Mehente over the summer ran mass trainings on defund the police. The International Longshore and Warehouse Workers ran solidarity action on Juneteenth to honor the long Black freedom struggle. There are broad coalitions all over the country to shut down jails or oppose jail construction or to run fights to defund the police. So Seattle, Los Angeles, the Bay Area, St. Louis, Minneapolis, Durham, and more. In some of these places, you see the demands to defund or shut down jails alongside participatory budgeting and people's budget work that's also important to think about. The Red Nation released its new Red Deal, this was now probably a year and a half ago, in conversation with the Green New Deal, and that Red Deal includes abolition of police, La Migra, and so-called child protective services as constitutive of its anti-capitalist and anti-colonial agenda. Graduate students and teachers unions have linked demands on universities and schools about labor conditions to police on campus and austerity budgets. Mutual aid networks straddle movements and communities, whether you think of something like the National Lawyers Guild Legal Observer Program, or you think of strike funds or coordinated bailouts, or water and food supply at protests or in neighborhoods. You can even think of the way that Haymarket Books stepped in with this amazing series of online political education, bringing together people across our movements to deepen our analysis and understanding the work that we have together. So there are increasingly interlinked campaigns and formations at different scales, local, statewide, and national, as well as increasingly kind of cohering analysis of the conditions under which we live and what we're fighting for. Those conditions being, as my co-panelists explained, a capitalism and colonialism that thrives on racialized and patriarchal division, that has created a state form deeply invested in policing, jails, prison, and military as a way to build increasingly concentrated wealth and to maintain relations of power through violence. And so the kind of increasingly interlinked campaigns and formations create a lot of space and expansiveness to build power. They take us out of the long-standing domain of critique for the left and into the domains of imagination and world building, out of siloed and separate movements, communities, and analysis to understand our fates and our struggles as linked. Nothing illustrates this more than our combined struggles around prisons and police, work and healthcare, housing and schools, and the environment. The recent power and water outages in Texas illustrate how questions of infrastructure are cross-cutting and increasingly important in the face of global climate crisis. These are all the struggles of all of our lives, even those people who don't see it or are committed to fighting us every step of the way. And I think there's some opportunity there. These are also fundamental questions about the shape of our political economy, recognizing that forces us to grapple with the necessity of labor organizing to the power of our movements, and even, I think, to rethink our relationship with elections. The historic unionization struggle in Alabama at an Amazon warehouse that is at least 80% Black and majority women will be important to watch and support. All of the talk of essential work and the refusal by electeds to take care of people without work or to shut down the economy because of their commitment to the market and waged labor have forced so many people to rethink our relationship to work and to labor organizing. And the recent presidential election was the first time in my lifetime that I saw a vocal and large portion of the left argue and mobilize people to vote for a neoliberal candidate, not because we like Biden, but because Biden was a better target for us strategically. And while that may be empirically debatable, it does seem right to me as a political position, and it seems significant that we have a growing number of people on the left that see elections as part of our strategic toolkit, although not obviously its entire terrain. Because of course, one of the myths of democracy under capitalism is that elections are the place for politics and participation. And of course, we know that politics is everywhere, in the workplace, at home, in the shape of our families, and on the streets. But recognizing elections as one place and engaging that space strategically alongside other strategies and tactics, not as the end all be all, but assessing it for its strategic importance in the context of a larger fight for political, economic, and social transformation seems important. The Sanders campaign and its massive popularity, built in large part through his commitment to healthcare for all, also has a lot of lessons for the strategic importance of elections within a larger movement ecosystem. So if we can recognize these connections between our struggles and our strategies and use them as a place from which to build a very large and interconnected we, not just in theory, but in practice, through the modes of organization that we build, we will be in a much stronger position than we are now. We should celebrate as we resist the temptation we all feel at the end of these moments to call it quits and retire from this work. We need rest as we think about how to shift in ourselves and the work as we try to expand our movements. In our lifetime, I think we can build organized mass movements, and I think that's where we should all be focused. We have movement, now we have to focus on getting more organized and more mass.
Thank you, Amna. Again, just so much to glean from all of what you said, and I think you're right. It is really interesting that despite the differences in questions and approach, that there seems to be a lot of common themes and coalescing even among our group today. Okay. So before we move ahead with more questions, I wanted to first give Cindy, Isaac, and Amna a chance to respond to anything you may have heard from each other in the first part of our conversation, if anything struck you, or if there's anything you want to build upon before I move ahead with another question.
Yeah, thank you so much to Isaac and Amna, and just really found just a couple of pieces. You know, I think Isaac, one, I just really want to recognize the leadership of the National Nurses Union and just how incredible in terms of really putting front and center the role of healthcare workers and nurses and patients, just a long trajectory. And we got an opportunity to work through the Frontline campaign and part of the broader front to defeat Trump. And just a lot of props to the work that's being done there very intentionally and for years. One of the pieces that, you know, I think you spoke to is this question of protagonism, right? And a lot of us have been in conversations about how do we think about who are then the protagonists of the struggle and sort of the leadership, right? The new leadership in the 21st century. And part of that, you know, is, you know, we talk about it in GGJ, and this comes from a framework from our Latin American comrades, is around the creation of new political subjects, right? And part of that is we see women of color, nurses, transgender Black folks, indigenous land defenders, feminists, children, you know, as really the agents of change, and not from a tokenistic point of view, and not from a sort of identity politic sort of point of view, or a gender or racial essentialist point of view, but actually as strategic, right? And as we understand the current economic political model, like what are the sort of points of intervention that workers, right, nurses can make, that teachers, that indigenous folks, right, defending their land and territories and fighting against like pipelines and fracking, for example, can make. And so I think that piece is something for us to really keep digging into. when we talk about frontline folks being, sort of the experts and needing to speak for themselves, it's not just a principle, it's actually about a strategic leadership that I think is necessary in this kind of plurinational state that we live in. And I think that is important for us to highlight in this moment. So that's one thing I just wanted to sort of echo and really underline in terms of what Isaac said. And then in terms of Amna, like, I feel like this point around, we were able to take on left absenteeism, right? And it feels like that was hugely significant. And I think we didn't go in, there were some of the battles around, oh, the lesser of two evils and all that. And I think that's that like we all said, that Harris, Biden and Harris was not like our fifth or sixth choice. I mean, it was like many of us were like Team Bernie. But one of the things is that we need to be able to say that we need a left radical perspective to electoral politics in this moment of bourgeois democracy, right? And I think that we got to be sober and clear about the terrain that we want to build on, and that there's no surprises. We're very clear about what kind of presidency and administration Biden and Harris were going to be. And there have been some surprises, in terms of how radical on some issues they've been, and then on regressive in terms of, for example, the deportations and bad, like already sort of failing on some of the promises. But I guess for me, it's more about how does the movement really develop a very comprehensive, radical understanding and approach to the electoral arena as we build for the new society, for radical democracy.
Thank you, Cindy. Amna or Isaac, do you have any other any responses to anything from the first part of our conversation?
I mean, there's so much to talk about. There's a part of me that I kind of have questions that I would love to put to Isaac and Cindy, but since we want to hear from the audience, I guess I can share some reflections. I mean, I think this piece about I think as Cindy put it, anti-racist, feminist, regenerative economy, and the question that Isaac put on the table of who's the working class that Cindy's now kind of elaborating on, seem really central to me. And I think it's like, it's going to be hard for me to put words to this on the fly, but like, I think we need to be having these conversations in the context of PIC abolition organizing as well. And I think we are. And part of the reason I say that is because, like in these fights to defund, or if you take the language of the movement for Black Lives, invest, divest, including in the turn to participatory democracy, et cetera, these campaigns are demanding a fundamental reorganizing of our political economy, which is very much focused on jobs and expenditures and capital accumulation within and through policing and military. And unless and until we think about, and I think this is one of the reasons why Green New Deal is really important. It's one of the reasons, and the Red Deal is important. It's one of the reasons why all of the organizing by teachers and nurses is really important, because they point us to the kinds of jobs that we need to be demanding and organizing for. We need more. I mean, I'm not going to remember the statistics offhand, but I remember at some point a couple of months ago hearing that a lot of the, like when we were worried about emergency rooms being filled up, that there in places people are saying it's not that we don't have enough hospital beds, although that's sometimes an issue. We don't have enough nurses to take care of people, and so just like trying to think about those connections between an economy organized on prisons and policing, and privatized housing and food, et cetera, versus an economy focused on care, poses some really fundamental questions about the kinds of jobs and work that we should be organizing towards. There's a really great article, it's one of my favorites in Jacobin, by Alyssa Battistoni, called something about thriving, not surviving, that talks about this, that I would really recommend to folks, that I think is really productive.
Thank you.
I hate to just like create an echo chamber here, but like I had your same questions kind of, and maybe a way to push forward and not just ask the same things is to think about. I've been thinking a lot about. I have the privilege of being an educator at NNU, and one of the things that I notice a lot in the past year from our nurses, from our nurse leaders, from rank and file nurses, is this question of while they're fighting, right? While they're fighting tooth and nail, also thinking, how can we expand space to think about this stuff, right? And really prioritizing, I'm not trying to be heady here, prioritizing a theory of their work, right? Prioritizing how can we think more deeply? And of course, different workers use different terms, right? But in the end, thinking how can we think with as much urgency as we think about fighting for PPE, how can we also think about how racial capitalism works, how gendered capitalism works, so on. And so my question for like everybody here is, how do we widen these spaces? And you know, just to give big ups to CPE, right? Because I think you all are a model of this, is how do we think about political education as a crucial, fundamental, you know, as essential work, right? And so I'm thinking about that across the different movements that we talked about. How do we create these spaces for political education, right? How do we create opportunities for it? And how do we do that kind of hard work of hashing out our like hierarchy of urgency, AKA strategy, and so on and so forth. The other thing that came up for me in thinking about your comments, Cindy, and your comments, Amna, is one of the things that nurses, phrases that nurses have been using a lot in the past year is thinking about social movement work as critical public health interventions, right? Thinking about like fighting against racism, fighting against sexism, fighting against the depredation of capitalism out in and amongst the community is a public health task and intervention, right? So kind of to flip that around, I'm also curious to hear from you all or whomever else in the chat about how to think of mass mobilizing, community organizing, whatever we want to say, as frontline work, right? So to expand the category of the frontline to not only think about labor, right, or salaried or wage labor, but as Cindy pointed out, the space of reproductive labor, the space of struggle. Yeah, I'm gonna stop it there and open and let others fly.
Cindy, I think it's just the dam is about to break on talking about a regenerative feminist economy. I think you're going to have to say something. Even Amna has given me a little nod that she was going to ask you as well, and we've heard a bunch of comments. I'm wondering if you can, you know, actually our own Jasmine Delgado was part of an event just yesterday that GGJ was hosting or co-hosting, and so I'm wondering, Cindy, if you could talk a little bit about it and maybe bring together some of these threads around reproductive labor and also the regenerative economy framework.
Absolutely. And I just want to shout out for folks who didn't get to watch. Last night we did a powerful launch of the United Frontline Table. We have a whole people's orientation to the regenerative economy. And so last night was around the feminist economy, and Jasmine was on there representing, I was like, the vision for a feminist peace, which we're part of with Women Cross DMZ and Madre, and really talking about a feminist peace initiative, right? Which is a component of the feminist economy. So one thing I just want to say, right, is that, you know, in this whole wave of wanting to go back to normal, we have to, as also the left, say there's aspects that we want. And I think this is the human connection, right? I want to hug, right? I want to go dancing. I want to cook for my friends. I want to see my mama, right? And I think we have to recognize the deep sort of isolation and that sort of almost like you know, when we're organizing on the street, people are going to say backward things, and it's part of the organizer to struggle with people, right? And so people are going to say they want to go back to normal. And I think we cannot, we cannot make people feel bad for that. I mean, the anti-vaxxers and the right-wingers, those motherfuckers, we need to punch them, but that's a whole other conversation. But I think that there has to be a realization of what it is that people are longing for, right? What it is that people are longing for and what it is that we desire. And that part of that is that there is going to be, like, we have to make an assessment of what we were able to learn and what it is that we still need to continue to unlearn around individualism, right? And then collective sense of self. And I think that's going to be, honestly, y'all, one of our biggest, like, it's what we see play out with, like, the mask is tyranny people to people being like, no, the mask is love. And I think that that battle at the hegemonic level, I think, is really key. And it's like reduced to that, but I think it's so deep around the work that we have to do and the political education that we have to do and the changing of minds that we have to do, right? So all of that to say is that some examples that we've been talking about in GGJ, and it's a collective work, not only of our alliances, but our sister alliances and like just the Climate Justice Alliance, Indigenous Environmental Network, the World March of Women, Right to the City Alliance, and many other folks, radical feminists from around the world. And then also work that's been done in the last 40 years, right? By both academics, but also social movement feminists, that there is these components that we're starting to articulate, right? That one, that we have to be in right relationship to nature. And that is something that we've been struggling, you know, as we see the climate crisis, see what's happening in Texas and the Midwest and the South, right? All of that, that there needs to be an empowerment of nature and nature having rights and us having a very different relationship, right? And so part of that is being able to talk about food sovereignty, right? And food and agroecology. And that, what does it mean to live in balance and in sustainable ways? How are we being interdependent, but also eco-dependent, right? And what is then how we think, even in terms of like the construction of knowledge, how do we think about ancestral knowledge, right? But how do we think even how knowledge is created in a collective way? And I think that's an important sort of component around how we think about what does it mean to recalibrate the relationship. It's like nature, like our bodies, should not be commodified, right? Should not be put on the market. And that's what we see so many of the battles happening, even like with the Paris Accords. Like it's a low bar to re-sign on to the Paris Accords because so much of it is based on carbon markets and still the selling and trading of emissions. So part of it is it's important that we're back in, but it's like we have way more work, y'all, on that. But it's like that right relationship to nature and being in it, because it is so patriarchal and it is so colonial, right? So number two is this concept of networks, creating networks of care and affection. And what does it mean to think about that, right? From like caring, one, how work is distributed equally from the home to our communities, to how we think about human development, right? How do we think about like our investment in people at different stages of their life? And how do we think about families, like diversified, expansive notions of families and communities? How do we coexist in rightful relationships, respectful relationships with each other? And where we don't sort of like, that diversity and difference is part of our strength. And that also we are, where our bodies, right? Our bodies and our sexualities and our expressions are like free and autonomous. And I think that to me is like this whole concept and this whole framework of what does it mean to have these sort of new paradigm shifts around networks of care and affection. Other points is really about like, how is it that the state, right, the government, the state is in function of life and sustainability and not profit, right? And it's like, if we put care and we put the body and we put people and the planet at the center and not capital, right? And not the system of death that we currently live under, like, what does that mean for public policy? What does it mean for for laws that like basically it's the intention of anything we create is in the recuperation and protection of life and its potential, right? So totally counter to what it is that we live under now. But then things like the Breathe Act, things like the Green New Deal, Medicare for All begin to be like life-sustaining policies, right? Not that it's not the revolution, it's not utopia, but it's that transition to there, right? That begins to create the space around what is something completely different, right? And that we really think about the creation of like the formation of new political and social organization, because I firmly believe that that's the way that we actually can, like that's democracy, and that's real democracy from the bottom on up. And so that we think about ways in which like we self-govern from like our blocks, workplaces, schools, to, you know, municipalities, regional kind of biosphere territories and things like that. So I feel like that to me those are some of the components. There's pieces around there. There's other components to the feminist economy that we're beginning to create and build. We've been doing these feminist organizing schools. Next week, we're launching the International Feminist Organizing School on Berta Casarez's birthday, and the school is actually called the Berta Casarez International Feminist Organizing School, because we believe that it's important for us to be talking about this not only here, but also globally. And how are we understanding this moment of like our new political project as an alternative, as the antidote to this current system, right? And I think that to me is some of this work. And so you can watch the video, which is brilliant. It should be on our website and or on our social medias. But I think it's a real testament to some of the work that we're doing, and as we reclaim feminisms from like the grassroots up.
Thank you so much, Cindy. So Amna, Isaac, and Cindy, I'm going to still kind of leave it open for all of you to respond to each other, because this is just so rich. But I wanted to interject a couple of audience questions, especially because I think that they connect to some of what you all are saying. Cindy, you mentioned, speaking of people who need to be punched in the face, as you said, you know, one of the comments and questions is about how much we should be focusing still on besting back white nationalism and fascism and the right, this fight against the right, versus ignoring that and focusing on building our base. And I do want to come back to some of these really generative ideas about, common spaces where we can dream together and world build, as Amna said before. But we still have this ongoing threat, and I'm wondering if any of you can speak to how we can, how we should be thinking about that, particularly in this transition of power period with the federal administration.
I can offer a quick thought about that. I mean, I would say from the perspective of unions, for example, we very much should be concerned about the continued threat of the authoritarian right? It's not to say that corporate Democrats are our best friends, as Cindy pointed out. That's a false dichotomy, I think, when we think of political struggle, right? When we think about a struggle for power and a path to power, right? But the corporate right, the authoritarian right, they are extremely clear. They say it in the open. They say it in their publications. They'll say it this weekend at their CPAC meeting, right? Unions, the rights to organize, are right in their crosshairs, and they make their own sort of twisted, whatever, villainous intersectionality, right? They see the attack on organized labor as being interwoven with their attack on the gains of people of color movements, of civil rights movements, of previous work movements, and of internationalist movements, and of feminist and queer movements. They're very clear about this. They also, even with the defeat of Trump, hold considerable amount of state power in this country on a local, regional, and national scale still. So I think that they are they are worth our attention, to say the very least, right? I also think around that question is, I don't think it's an either or. For workers, who are organizing in their workplace, one of the things that our union talks about in the fight to organize and the fight to win good contracts, the fight to bargain, is the fight for democracy in the workplace. So I'm thinking about the workplace as a place where workers come up against brutalist authoritarian rule on the part of the bosses. And so their efforts to expand their voice, their perspective, but also their how they do their work, what they're able to say, what they're able to advocate for, who they're able to advocate, and to exert the leadership coming from their various positionalities, particularly as people of color, as women and gender nonconforming workers in the lead. I think these fights against authoritarianism, against racism, against sexism take place in the workplace. So I think it's one helps do the other, right? And winning power in the workplace against the authoritarianism of capital puts you in a good fighting form to make those strides politically. So I would just offer that as a quick thought.
There's nothing I can say to elaborate on that would make it better. Like, that was a perfect and beautiful answer, and I learned so much. Thanks, Isaac. I actually wanted to ask you a question in response to that, which is, yeah, and hearing you talk, it just made me wonder, this idea of the working class is so often weaponized by elites as a way to okay, I'm getting I'm getting at the late Eastern Standard Time now, but it's weaponized by elites against radical movements and organizing as a way to kind of shut us up or de-radicalize us, to say in the election that happened. And I'm just wondering, when you are organizing nurses and with the nurses that you work with, within union spaces, what kind of talk back or reflection is there to that way that the working class is talked about? Does that make sense?
What kind of, you're asking how do they respond to the disparaging?
Yeah.
I mean, my simple and at the risk of propagandistic answer is they say we fight for power, right? I think part of building labor movement, but a workers movement or working class movement in general, is to build. Yeah, I'm gonna risk sentimentalism here. Is to build pride in it, right? Is to build a sense of history and connection. I think that's why in this moment it's so important and urgent that workers think about their history, right? And think about other workers internationally, but also I would think, I guess, about thinking about workers across borders. I would also include thinking about working class struggles that aren't in the workplace, that are, for example, amongst prisoners, right? Amongst the working class that's imprisoned, amongst folks who are struggling on the border, so on. I think that expansive thinking adds fuel and momentum to that positionality, right? To that, it might not be pride. My mom raised us with the word ganas, right? That willpower to keep fighting in an expansive way. So I don't know. I feel lucky to work with workers who are proud to be workers, right? And I think that they cultivate and tend to that pride while also having open eyes around the contradictions amongst working people, right? Around the fact that for the working class in general, any number of their co-workers, friends, and family members find themselves on the right, so on and so forth. So it's also with eyes wide open as well. So I don't mean to be, I'm gonna have my cake and eat it too. I mean to be romantic, and then I'm gonna say I'm not trying to be too romantic.
Thanks, Isaac. I want to get in another good question, interesting question from our audience. And I think, Cindy, this was initially directed at something you were, I think, alluding to around using our radical imagination to envision what it is we want. And the question is, I'm wondering if the panelists can speak to the cultural moment that we're in, where on the one hand, we are seeing some tremendous radical organizing, but against a backdrop of, at best, diluted and appropriative cultural narratives, and at worst, upholding fascist norms via cultural narratives and production.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think it's part of what you know, where we have to get ahead of the game and be defining that the sort of new normal, right? And sort of uplifting. You know, it's like what I said to begin with. It's like, who would have imagined that defund the police is, you know, sort of the WNBA like standing so like we're like pivotal in the defeat of like the Georgia senator, you know, and in terms of like it's like there was a moment in which movements, right? Millions, like over 26 million people went out in the streets during a pandemic in defense of Black lives, right? In challenging white supremacy reckoning. And then to be able to then see it play out in multiple layers of society, both civil society and other sectors, I think to the point where now it's like getting commodified, you know, by the ruling elites and by tech and Nike and all those folks. But I think that is, I think there's a deep lesson there, right? And I think the same thing, it's like we're movements, indigenous folks, right? Taking the stand, like 9 months at Standing Rock, right? It started off with a small encampment that then turned into this like, you know, prairie fire of defense, land defense, water protection, right? The whole concept of water protectors. We're not protesters, we're water protectors, and reframing that and being able to be today, right? That Deb Haaland is now being potentially the, like, you know, the head of the Department of Interior. Like, damn, like some of that shit, you're just like, wow, it's like, there's a connection between all of that, right? It's like, it's no accident that then these things, things that we do on the ground, things that the sort of counter hegemonic framing that we put out has impact, right? And sometimes it's years and decades of the hard work, you know, but then sometimes it's like moments where it's like there's a psychic break, right? Like Occupy Wall Street, right? That all of a sudden capitalism was on Time magazine and we started talking about like alternatives to capitalism. And so it's more of like, to me, it's a question, it's like, what are movements doing to prepare? What's the groundwork we do? And we know the hard work, the daily grind of building organization, building, you know, doing the leadership development work, building out campaigns. And then, but also in these moments where these psychic breaks happen, how do we actually take an opportunity? And I think there's such a good lesson from what happened 7 years ago from BLM to then, you know, this summer. And then like, what do we then sort of, you know, as my comrade Mo says, it's like, how do we then begin to, you know, electoralize the movement? And how do we then begin to see that the movement demands that seem so far off then become the new center of gravity, right? And I think that's not an easy task, and it doesn't happen like magic. And it takes a lot of united front work actually as well. And I think that that's something that I feel like is really important. But I think we've witnessed it, we've lived it. And I think with the pandemic, there's an opportunity, I think, in a lot of ways to bring front and center this feminist articulation that for decades, you know, feminists have been putting forward, and more sharply, like with like militant women's movement and gender nonconforming people's movements all over the world, sort of being at the front against patriarchal authoritarians, you know. And I think that this is a moment for us to pave the way and really begin to say this: what is the kryptonite to these, like, you know, patriarchal, homophobe, racist? And it's our articulation. And I think that we have to then be able to make it material for folks, but also not shy away from talking about the big ideas, you know. And I think that's one lesson that I come to time and time again, is like, we got to have both, right? It's like the bread and butter issues, but also the ideas and that give us that vision and that opportunity to imagine that something new is possible.
Thank you, Cindy. Isaac or Amna, do you want to add anything to that? You can also. Okay, so there's another line of questions here that I also thought I think we're seeing some themes around. Cindy, you had mentioned kind of these ideas around self-governance, and I think we talked a little bit about some of the radical organizing projects like mutual aid that have come out of the past year. But there's also, and this is one of the questions, which is that there's been all of the horrific atrocities that happened during the Trump era and failures of the state. Texas this week and last week, and the vaccine rollout, and so many things. And the question is, what do you see as a path forward for the narrative that government could be a possible place to take care of one in another, rather than just treachery? And I think it's complicated. I mean, I think that there's it's even more complicated now that we, as you mentioned, have a neoliberal administration which is breaking promises and delivering on some things. But I'm wondering, particularly now as we're moving into a new stage, how we deal with that question about we're talking about government as a place and the state as well as a place for some of that work.
I can say two things really quickly. I mean, one is, one thing we haven't talked about is that there's also a resurgence of anarchist politics among the left. At least I see that. And so I think we have some kind of brewing internal debates that, will be ongoing. I don't think that the left is aligned around the state as the solution. And in fact, I think one of the reasons that, there are many reasons, including decades of organizing, that made the last summer protests to rally around defund. But I think one of them was precisely because a demand like defund can create an umbrella for anarchist and more state-oriented conceptions of our horizon among the left. So that's one thing, because for assessing the left, I think that's part of what is going on, and I think it's partly precisely because of the prison industrial complex and the gutting of the state that there is reasonable deep suspicion of the state and what it can do, and of course long debates within the left around that. And then the second thing is, I think the questions around building infrastructure to provide for people's needs, whether it's healthcare or clean water or power, like the questions raised by Texas in the face of environmental disaster, are a place to think and talk and conceptualize about the need for the state or some form of organized capacity to build things that we all need. And I would point to, I think Grassroots Policy Project has put out a lot of good work on this stuff. Harmony Goldberg, there's actually I think multiple versions of this on their website, but Harmony Goldberg has a 10-page thing on their website called Stepping into the Moment, where she talks about how central to our ideological struggle right now is precisely to posit government for the common good. And again, obviously from a state-oriented perspective, but that seems to me right, and in a way that I've learned most deeply from critical resistance, points to the importance of, understanding the interconnections between our battle, both as material and ideological. And so as we fight for example, turning jails into housing or whatever, also kind of thinking and talking about government for the common good, as Harmony puts it.
Thanks, Amna. Isaac or Cindy, do you have any responses on that?
I mean, go ahead, Cindy. it's probably worth another series of events to think about the state moving forward and the differences between or the distinctions rather between the state and government and governance, right? These are different things, but I'll say that I think they're all terrains of struggle, right? And they're all contain as I think Ruthie Gilmore put it, residues of struggle and potentials, right? To bring it down to the ground, I'm thinking about one of the ways, and I think there's a lot of unfinished business, particularly as we think about border struggle, settler colonialism, so on. So there's a lot of unfinished business and a lot of further thinking and deeper thinking and thinking together and struggling to do around these things. I'm thinking around Medicare for all. It's one of the things I'm here to talk about, right? Is that I want to challenge myself and others, or offer at very least, is that, you know, winning Medicare for all legislation, right, is a step in a wider struggle. But I'm wondering, and I'm just thinking about this right now, right, is that, you know, it's not just to win a thing from the federal government that reflects what is right, right? That certainly is true. Most people want Medicare for all. Certainly it should be a human right, right? This is like, it's like a basic, and at this point, globally is a minimum demand, right? But thinking about what the work that happens to win that and the different alliances, united fronts, and moments for leadership and so on, I think is an interesting thing when we think about governance. I also think about that once something like that is won, it's not only that it's won and then we're good and then we can go get healthcare. It also increases the capacity of workers and peoples to have control over, to take away some of the dictatorship of healthcare capital in this point of view, in this thing. And that makes me wonder, after, if we can create those spaces through moderate wins, what sort of other interesting possibilities and questions come up when we think about governance or the long history and struggles around the state.
Yeah, I was gonna try to tie a couple of the questions that came in, and that I think, for me, if I think about like the main political task of the moment, is one, I feel like, you know, we didn't take Trump seriously, you know, 5 years ago. And and we didn't even, many of us didn't even take seriously that, you know, there would be like a peaceful, like there would be a potential coup, right? An insurrection. And so, and even now, right? And so I feel like, to me, we have to take very seriously and monitor and be aware, right? Sort of first task of any conscious organizer, revolutionary, is to know your enemy, right? And so there is a deep consolidation, a kind of sort of fight for the heart of the Republic, not only the Republican Party, but also like that whole sort of ideology. And that, you know, in a lot of ways, the people on the six, you know, sort of people saying, oh, there are these like ragtag, you know, sort of folks, and there's just like a lot of derogatory comments about where they're from in the South or this and that or whatever. But it's like, one, we have to be clear. The Oath Keepers were the vanguard of that. They were leading the strategy and the tactics. If you actually look at the footage of who was actually telling them where to go, how to go, what windows to break, where to go, it's like that actually is a level of organization that many of us who do tactics and actions recognized. Number two, the Proud Boys, right? They're not just white. And I think we need to actually really be clear that it's not, it is around sort of protecting what is it, defense of like sort of Western civilization. But it's a multiracial, multi-class formation. They're even okay with the gays, right? They're even okay with the gays. Their one line is transgender folks, but they're okay with the gays. But I think part of it is like the Proud Boys as a multiracial front also is we got to be able to track the three presenters, QAnon, and then the neo-fascists, right? And then the MAGAs and the Republicans. But all of this to say is that this kind of refoundation and reconsolidation of the right and is going to be important, because I think, and then Trump positioning himself and resurfacing to lead that. They are already, like yesterday, already working on the for the election, the midterm elections. They already have a clear path beginning to articulate for 4 years from now. They're already coming back to the state capitals, like here in North Carolina last Monday, talked about a whole agenda that was like no defunding the police, no to any of our progressive demands at the statewide level. And so I think they ain't playing, right? And they don't play, they take off their gloves. And so I think part of it is that we have to understand where the terrain of struggle and their ability to maneuver at multiple levels. So they're like, okay, and then the filibusters that they'll create at the congressional level. That's one thing. The second thing is that we have to continue to rupture with what is considered normal and be part of the emancipatory paradigms, right? And to change the current model. And that is a long-term trajectory, right? I think that that's one thing. It's like, I'm not a purist, but I do believe in utopia. But I think that we have to have models. We have to have pilots. We have to have experimentation. We have to have whole countries like, Bolivia and Cuba. And we have to have territories having liberatory, emancipatory practices, and we have to fail and we have to learn and we have to do it again, because the shit ain't easy. And I think that that's some of the stuff that we in the US sometimes have like a real problem with, thinking about power and thinking about concessions and thinking about, sort of how do we live in the world we want, but then the reality of where we're at. And so I just think that there's a desperate need for us to really do experimentation, pilots, and experiment at multiple levels, and then take things to scale. So being able to have those models where like something like the Breathe Act can pass in Illinois is like really important as an not only inspiration, but also as a way for us to practice what that looks like. And then I think the last thing is that we live in a bourgeois democracy, and we're going to have to be able to expand, for example, the squad. It's like we have to be able to be clear about what political terrain we want to be in as we're doing those other tasks. And I think, to me, what's important and what's exciting is that those folks, most of them didn't come out of our movement, and we need to basically adopt them and protect them, because they're throwing punches for us at the national level, right? They're getting death threats. They're like putting themselves out there, and we need to be able to figure out how to be able to have their back, but also be in relationships. So like, for example, Jamal Bowman, just recently elected, he is leading the charge in terms of putting out a resolution around the care economy. So all the crazy shit I just talked about with the leadership of the national domestic workers, with caring cross generations, with a whole bunch of other partners and us, like he has a resolution that's coming out on Monday with Senator Warren about the care economy. And it's all of our stuff. It's all of our stuff, from the planet to workers to healthcare to minimum wage and so I think that those are the things that are important, that we have to be able to, as a left, mature into being able to say, how do we actually then put forward some of our radical ideas with some of our friends in power and have that be part of a bigger coordinated strategy?
Cindy, you started to get into what I think will be my closing question, if we can squeeze in a response or two, maybe from Isaac and Amna, which is forecasting a little bit, getting the crystal ball out and doing a little bit of forecasting for everyone who's here about what some things that you think are important for us to keep an eye on, or some predictions you have about how things will shape up in the coming days, months, or year. And so we'll do that. And then I want to also welcome in Hunter from Causa Justa Just Cause, who will help us in talking a little bit about calls to action on behalf of Causa Justa Just Cause and in place of Vanessa. But Isaac and Amna, I want to turn to you both first, just quickly, just to see if there are any forecasts that you also have, or things that you think we should be tracking. Cindy kind of laid out a few things and also some prescriptives as well, but are there a couple things that either of you think are important for us to have folks leave with.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll name three things. One is just to point out a through line that just articulating a slightly different way. I think so many of the demands coming out of today's movements have to do with budgeting and budgets and where and how local money in particular, but money at the different scales of government is spent. And so those kinds of demands, whether it's defund the police or investing in healthcare or a jobs guarantee, I think those are in the way that Cindy was just talking about the Bowman bill on Monday. Those are that feels to me like a really important shift that marks that kind of creates a like a set of demands that are materialist and that electeds can run with, and that are very scary to the ruling class. And so I think we need to continue with that. I think the connections between racial justice, prison and police work with questions of the environment, labor and housing seem really central. And I think we need to continue to make those connections. And then the last piece is that we have all learned, I think, and obviously we've known this in some ways for a long time, the importance of local organizing. But we also see through examples like Florida Amendment 4, which was the ballot initiative to enfranchise incarcerated people, or efforts in Austin to cut the police budget, that when we have local basically the way, many ways that federalism tries to undermine organizing and community power. And so then you have Republican states then quashing those local wins through the governor or the state legislatures. And so, while I think it's absolutely right that we're focused deeply on local organizing, understanding that the terrain is out, the power functions at different scales feels really important as well.
This is one of those challenging questions because we're on video, and then I'm going to say things, and then they're going to be, they won't happen, and things like this. So it's keeping it speculative, but as materialist as possible, as Amna said. I think we're in for some hard times. I'm really appreciating the spirit and the good sort of optimism that's in the chats and so on. And we're facing some hard times, right? And so I think to just be a little cold in the assessment for a second, I think in the coming days and years, capital will do what it's meant to do, right? Which is to bend crisis to its advantage by all means necessary, right? And it'll, try to do that vis-a-vis profits. It'll do that vis-a-vis disciplining workers and suppressing worker organizing. Capital will create political alliances with the right wing and with liberal political forces to, influence to its advantage environmental, legal, labor, foreign policy standards and priorities, right? Elites across the political spectrum will prioritize managing the expectations of working people. I think we'll see that, right? And internationally, I think sanctions regimes will continue to create suffering and inhibit the mobilization from the perspective of health workers of global health policies. The right, as we've noted, will continue to try to hold the ground it has and regain the ground it's lost, and it'll assert its agenda against the aspirations of working people, as has been said. I think from the perspective of a working class movement, there's going to be some serious labor struggles ahead. And those are going to be hard and they're going to be exciting, right? And I think there will be serious and hard and exciting political and social struggles as well, particularly as it comes to overcoming white supremacy and inequality in this country. And I think, just to piggyback off of some of what my co-panelists have said, I think redistributive struggles will be key in that regard. Some people call it defunding, whatever we want to call it. I think redistributing economic and political priorities will be key for progressive forces, left forces, workers in the thick of it. Opportunities will abound to develop leadership, political education, increase fusion with social movements or among social movements, and increase internationalism. I mean, those are have been the ones for the past 100 years, but they're evergreen for better and worse.
I think the only thing I'll add, and to end it a little bit on a more positive note, because I agree with everything that Isaac has said, but I also, and Amna has said, but I feel like, to me, what's so exciting, and I think what people are so hungry for, is that alternative vision, right? It's that alternative vision. And I believe that a just transition to the anti-racist regenerative economy is the opportunity to be able to push boldly for divestment out of extractive and war-making economy, and to really invest in this type of economy in which we honor the rights of Mother Earth, where reparations are made to communities around the world and also here that have been disproportionately harmed by racial and gendered and imperialist capitalism, and that we work to reproduce ourselves and our communities that is in a way that's recognized, valued, and shared joyfully. And I think that to me is the opportunity before us, right? It is gonna be hard, the gloom and doom, I agree with that, to be hella real about that. But also I think we have to, that's the one take away from us, is our vision and our hope and our joy. And I think that's what we have to be able to also in this moment provide and think, and again, keep reminding ourselves what seemed like impossible is now possible. So thank you. This has been incredible. And I just really want to thank, and I can continue talking to Amna and Isaac forever, and Thomas. And so just really want to be very grateful for this opportunity to share and follow our work and support our work and support the local base building groups. And I want to pass it to one of our member groups, the Causa Justa, Just Cause, who's here to talk about some actions, right? And next steps.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, what an analysis to follow, and we'll dig into some of those material struggles. My name is Hunter. I'm the communications organizer at Causa Justa Just Cause, and I'm filling in for Vanessa Moses, our executive director, who's unfortunately very sick right now, and very sad. She had to be dragged away from this discussion tonight. But we did want to use the opportunity to let you know about some of the struggles that are moving locally as we envision new futures for our communities, and as we engage in some of those redistributive fights to build power and community control in working class Black and Brown neighborhoods in Oakland and San Francisco. So today was pretty exciting. We were just part of releasing a collective report as part of the Defund OPD Coalition, responding to the 114 recommendations that were put forth by Oakland's task force to reimagine public safety in Oakland. Spoiler, we liked some of them, but not all. But you can check out the report and find more ways to plug into defund organizing in Oakland at bit.ly/reimagine/Oakland or -Oakland. And I believe these are also going in the chat, or I will put them in afterwards. And then also to be helping push the task force and calling on the city to be investing in community safety. We're also encouraging any BIPOC residents of East and West Oakland that are on the call to fill out Oakland Rising survey on safety for Black and Indigenous POC in Oakland. And you can do that at oaklandrising.org/survey. And then, yeah, we're also part of the national movement to cancel rent. I'm going to try and be fast, but if you want to get involved in that, text HOMES at 40649. And then locally, we're putting on Know Your Rights trainings on how to navigate some of the piecemeal protections that we're getting from the state and national level, and how they're intersecting with some of the wins that we've been able to advance locally. So those are for San Francisco tenants on the March 17th, and Oakland tenants on March 24th. And you can follow us on Facebook for more details on how to register for those trainings, and please share them with folks that you know that might be at risk. And I will put our links in the chat. Thank you.
Hunter, thank you so much. And we send our best to Vanessa and hope she gets well very soon. Amna, Cindy, and Isaac, any last minute calls to action? I'll give you all a minute just to kind of run through something real quick.
I'm just going to put a link to our Medicare for All page here. Sign up and support the movement to win Medicare for All. And if you sign up on that, you'll also get all kind of updates on how to support frontline workers in struggle on a variety of scales. So check it out, sign up, get involved. Thank you all. Thank you, thank you, thank you all.
Amna?
I'm just going to lift up again the call to donate to the Center for Political Education, because we need to fund organizations like Center for Political Education, which often don't get large grants from large institutions that give money to other kinds of background movement organizations or movement organizations. CPE is so important, and we should all support them in whatever way we can.
Thank you, Amna.
I think just very quickly to add, so be on the lookout for the CARE resolution that will be launched next Monday by Representative Bowman, Jayapal, and Senator Warren, along with all the groups that I mentioned before. The Green New Deal, we're part of the Green New Deal National Table, and we just launched the Thrive Agenda. And that's something really around sort of recovery and jobs, and really creating, it's the first installment of the Green New Deal. And so be on the lookout and support that, and we're asking people to sign up and actually put some pressure on Biden around the Thrive Agenda. Obviously, the support around Medicare for All, the Breathe Act, the People's Bailout. There's a whole, as you all know, 1.9 trillion stimulus. We are making bold demands around granting citizenship to essential workers, to monthly $2,000 payments, healthcare for all, a jobs core around public health, restoring the public health that was cut by Trump. Like 50,000 public health workers were cut in the last 4 years. And sort of really being able to be bold and push the envelope on the stimulus and then beyond in these next 3 weeks. And then the last piece is the Feminist Peace Initiative and supporting. So we're asking for folks to sign on to the Feminist Peace Initiative as an endorser, and really breaking the binaries between domestic and foreign policy, and like not only defunding the police, but defunding detention centers, ICE, and the Pentagon, and really fighting sanctions, etc. So those are things that folks can get involved. You can go to our website, ggjalliance.org, but there's many organizations and sister organizations that are all part of this work.
Thank you, Cindy. And again, thank you, Cindy, Amna, and Isaac, so much for your incredible insights, for the learning we've been able to do together tonight. Thank you all again to our interpreters from Antenna and our captioner, Joyce with Caption Associates, and to everyone who joined us, Hunter and Casa Justa for joining us late. We're so glad to have you. And for all of you who are watching and joining us tonight, really just appreciate the conversation tonight. And we hope you're leaving with some insights and tools that can help you craft your own understanding and assessments of political conditions in your neck of the woods, in addition to mapping pathways for greater cohesion and solidarity among left political forces, as all of our panelists laid out in so many wonderful ways. And I'll leave you, I'm gonna actually leave you, and this might be my tradition in doing events, because this is my first CPA event that I'm facilitating. I'm gonna leave you with Clara Cabral's Invocation. Learn from life, learn from our people, learn from books, learn from the experience of others, never stop learning. Thank you all and good night.